All right, here we go with unit number 3. I feel like it's been a while since I've done a video, so kind of looking forward to get back into it. Okay, so the video that we're going to start off with today is I'm going to go through and just sort of introduce the unit again and its importance to us. Now, if we were in class, what I normally do is a little activity where I present these 6 pictures and I get the class to guess what sort of characteristic of a living thing is it trying to show. So we have a bunch of different things that are characteristics that represent what all living things do or need or go through as a living organism. So the first one represents movement. We all move to some degree. We need some sort of energy to eat, digest our food, and get energy out of it. This one represents reproduction. All living things reproduce in some way. And we all grow, so we aren't the same size as we were when we were born. So this represents growing. This one, I think you can probably guess what this represents, but it represents excretion. We all, as living things, need to be able to get rid of wastes. And then our final one is that we undergo some form of what we call in science respiration. And so this is really a big part of our unit. So for all living things, respiring. So for us, in this example, it's showing this person expelling or breathing out air, and in which case for us that's carbon dioxide that's coming out. So all of these really revolve around the need for energy. We can't do any of these processes if we don't have energy. So this unit really focuses on how do all organisms, plants and animals, obtain their energy. So where do we get our energy from? If you're a human or animal of some sort, then we go through a process called respiration. And here's the simple word equation for what respiration is. We're taking glucose, so this comes from the food that we eat. We're adding it in with the oxygen, so the air that we breathe. And in our bodies, what this next part of the unit we're going to learn about is a whole bunch of stuff happens in between for us to get these two final products plus our energy. Okay, so this is a really, really simple equation of what we're about to talk about. And probably up until now in most science classes, this is about the extent of what we see when we talk about respiration and photosynthesis. So probably another thing you probably are familiar with at this stage is that photosynthesis is basically the reverse process of respiration. So if you look at the final products of respiration, they're actually the reactants for photosynthesis, and the final products for photosynthesis are the reactants for respiration. So these two processes are complementary. Photosynthesis provides the oxygen that we breathe on this planet, so if it weren't for plants, we would not be able to survive here. And so this is sort of cyclical. The plants give us our glucose, let's say a food source of some sort, plus our oxygen. And we take that and make carbon dioxide and water. Well, plants need both of those products as well. So we really complement. I use the word complement because we're both helping each other out in this process. Now, if we were to get a little bit more detail with respiration, the same formula, now we're using a chemical formula instead of a word equation. And there's something else here, this extra little word called ATP. And hopefully you've had a chance to do a little bit of the reading in your textbook about what these things are. I know a lot of what you read or what I left you to do is probably new material, but it's we're going to be learning a lot of terms and definitions. And so I thought it would be helpful for you to go ahead and try to become familiar with some of them. And it might have felt a little overwhelming with a lot of information and new material and material that you're not necessarily familiar with, but it's going to help you work through this unit, and we're going to take it one step at a time. So don't be too concerned yet if you feel a little bit overwhelmed. You're definitely allowed to. So let's just simplify what ATP is. So ATP, and I'm going to show you on the next page, stands for a big long term called adenosine triphosphate. Now, we'll get to that in a second, but basically here's a good analogy. In order to drive a vehicle, a car, it requires gas. So we convert chemical energy of gas into mechanical energy or kinetic energy to make this car move. We as organisms, every single living organism, needs energy to do all of those 6 things that I just showed you pictures of. Okay, and our form of energy really truly comes from this ATP molecule, and it can come from a couple of different ways. Yes, we think of our energy being food, but once that food's broken down and enters our bloodstream, what's happening is really revolves around this molecule. This is our key player for gaining our energy in the end when we look at each process in detail. Okay, so ATP is like gasoline for a car. It's our form of energy. Now, here's what ATP looks like. So here's the long word for ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And I'm going to just point out something to help you out a little bit whenever I can. Oh, here we go. The word tri, whenever you see that, means 3. If you see tri in front of any word, it means 3. If you see, and I think we went through this when we talked about carbohydrates and proteins, if you see di in front of a word, it means 2. And if you look at the structure, you do not need to memorize the chemical makeup or formula or structure for this at all. But you should recognize that adenosine triphosphate is an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphates attached, and that's where the word triphosphate comes in its name. Same thing, adenosine here, but now it just has 2 phosphates. Okay, so that's just the difference between ATP, when you see ATP, and ADP, because you're going to start to see these a lot throughout the unit. Okay, and you might be asking yourself now, sorry, this is the page number, you're going to find a little bit of this in your textbook as well. You might be asking yourself, okay, well, how do we get our energy from this molecule that I don't recognize right now? I've never even heard of it, maybe. So there's 2 ways that you can make ATP. And these 2 are important to know. So you should know the difference between these 2 terms. The first one, substrate level phosphorylation, we would consider this a direct method of making it. Okay, and basically what we're doing is we're taking a phosphate containing compound and transferring one of its phosphates to an ADP. And if we're adding one more phosphate to ADP, we're actually making ATP, right? If we start with 2 and we're adding one more, we end up with 3 total, so we end up with ATP. This reaction here represents this process, but in both directions. Okay, so the important thing to remember about substrate level phosphorylation is just that it's about transferring phosphates back and forth. That's really the main thing. And we call that direct because we're directly adding a phosphate or taking it away. And so you'll notice that both these go in both directions. So we can take an ADP, add a phosphate on to make ATP, or we can take ATP, remove a phosphate, and here is the key, right here. If we have an ATP molecule and we remove one of its phosphates, we're making energy, okay? And to not to get too detailed or base it on chemistry, anyone that has a bit of a chemistry background will know that chemical bonds have a stored form of energy. Okay, and actually I did direct you to one page in your textbook that sort of dealt with bond energies and talked about, your book gives a little more detail than I want you to know. Here's what I want you to know. In this case, when we have an ATP with our 3 phosphates and we are removing one of them, when we break that bond, energy is released. Okay, so that's where some of our energy is coming from, is when we break a chemical bond, energy can be released. And that's all I really want you to know about that. There's a lot more chemical and chemistry-based details to that, but all I want you to know is, how is ATP giving us energy? Well, we're transferring some of its phosphates to other molecules in our body, and then we're also taking them back to make this process sort of cyclical. And anytime we break that bond, we're actually getting energy out of it. So it's kind of like our gasoline for our vehicles. That's where it's coming from the breaking of those bonds. And so the second way that we can make ATP, and this we consider to be an indirect method, is through a process called oxidative phosphorylation. This is a series of enzyme catalyzed, remember enzymes speed up reactions, And there, in this case, oxidative phosphorylation means that we're talking specifically about redox reactions. Do you remember redox reactions from our first unit? Redox reactions, remember, in general, just to kind of help jog your memory, just involves transfer of electrons. So redox reactions, we're either gaining some electrons or losing some electrons. And you're going to see that we can actually create, our bodies have a way of creating ATP through this method. This definition is not going to make complete sense to you until we've completed the unit and you can actually see what these enzyme catalyzed reactions look like. But at this stage of the game, all you need to know is that ATP is the energy form that our body needs. There's two ways to make it. One is by directly adding and taking away phosphate groups. The second is through a series of long reactions that we go through. And so that's basically it, just to introduce to you, A, that all living organisms need energy, and B, for all of us living organisms, our form of energy where we gain it from ultimately is through a molecule ATP.